We'll keep things moving. Hello, everybody. I want to thank the Heartland Institute for this opportunity. It's second only to the opportunity I got when I walked in to the EPA for the first time as part of the transition team. It was an exciting moment. I've got to tell you, the three of us were all on the transition team. Myron headed. In the building today is also David Schneer, who is on the team, and Amy Oliver Cook. There were 10 of us officially on the team. We're not allowed to talk about the action plan that we put together or whether it's being implemented. But I can put it this way. We volunteered. I had to walk away from my day job for a month or so. We had to take care of our own food. And even though the door you walk into at the EPA on Constitution Avenue is right next to the Trump Tower, we had to do our own hotel. So, the question I think that should be asked is, do we feel like we wasted our time based on what has happened so far in the last year and what we expect to happen in the next year? And I can assure you, none of us feel like we wasted our time. And that's all I'm allowed to tell you. So we'll move on to what's going on. So I chose Wilmington, Delaware, because I live in Delaware. 1980 to 2016, you can see the number of days that we exceeded air quality index. So that's the index of the 6 criteria, pollutants plus ozone. I can tell you back in 1980 with 142 days, 40 of those days were 2.5 times the air quality standard, and it was a looser standard back then. We needed to clean up our air. I'm going to agree with Steve on this. None of us want dirty air. We should all be really proud of what we've done, where now we're bouncing along close to 0 days. And by the way, the standard allows you to skip a couple days. So in Delaware, we're actually at the standard. We're below the standard now. We're clean, officially clean. A couple of things to think about here. One is we're getting close to diminishing returns. How much better are we going to get? I will go on to the next slide here. So these are the individual pollutants. The red line is the standard, and it's just the 100% mark for each standard. The standards are all different, obviously. But you see a lot of these are really way below. Like look at lead, the smallest column there. Lead is 95% below the standard, yet in 2016 there was still a single area that was had non-attainment. Now, a specific plan was arranged, and this year that last non-attainment zone will reach attainment for lead. So, I mean, that's great. But you also see there's a couple here. You look at ozone, the tall one on the end there, and PM 2.5, which we've had a lot of discussion on today. We're probably not going to get much better on those. And the reason is there's a huge natural component in both of those. Now, when the ozone standard was revised in 2015, there was a debate within the EPA of how you figure out what is the natural component to this. So the EPA came up with a computer model that said it's in the mid-30s parts per billion. The standard was 75, it's now 70, but the 70 has been delayed for 2 years. So there was another group in the EPA who discussed it and said, well, what we ought to be doing is using the actual results from the most rural stations. And those tend to be in the mid-60s. So mid-30s to mid-60s, and we're setting a standard at 70. So now, if you're within 10%, if the standard is within 10% of the natural background, you're never going to meet the standard. There's always going to be that hot summer day when you go over the standard. So the EPA decided to rely on models, which we all know computer models are better than actual data. So the EPA is least consistent. They relied on the models. So I want you to think about this. Imagine what the EPA should look like if we have met all the air quality standards. Secondly, There's 15,000 people at the EPA. 7,500 of them are in the region offices. Now, when the EPA was formed, it made a lot of sense to have regional EPA offices. But now you've got state operations, tiny Delaware. We have less than 1 million people. We only have one congressional representative, and he should be like 6/10 of a representative, or she right now. With that small population, our state natural resource department has 750 employees. And there's a lot of other bigger ones around the country. So we don't really need the regional offices anymore. And so you cut that, and now you cut from being, it's a whole change of thinking. What should the EPA look like without regional offices? And with all they're doing is managing. We're not trying to improve the air quality anymore, we're just going to manage it. All right, now put the other hat on. Let's say you're a career professional at the EPA. How do you survive cuts that you could imagine from that type of thing? Well, two things you do. You find pollutants that we can't meet and you can always regulate. So you do that one with ozone. If you set the ozone standard low enough, the states will never meet it, and you can always regulate and control things. And you can do the same thing with carbon dioxide. So part of the push to regulate those is to keep the EPA in its current form. So what's happened lately? First of all, the Obama EPA was so involved in what was going on with the climate change agenda, which the Climate Action Plan was just pervasive through the entire government, and particularly at the EPA. So you see here, on average, air quality improved 2% a year from 1980 to 2009, but only 1% a year during President Obama's term. Ozone improved 1% a year from 2008 to 1980 to 2009, but only 0.5% total under the Obama EPA. Superfund site cleanups dropped from 35 a year under President Bush to 16 a year under President Obama's EPA. 2010, the EPA took over the Chesapeake Bay plan. The states were doing great. They improved the index 49%, but since 2010, there's been zero improvement. So things really got out of control, and we're looking at diminishing returns. The worst thing is EPA lost integrity. I'm not going to go through this entire list. You can read it. I would like to talk about a couple of them. The one thing that really hasn't been dealt with is the second one. They're using exaggerated value of life. It's based on a survey. There's another way to do that. You can instead look at the cost, the value of lost earnings. If you do that, instead of $9 or $10 million per year of life, it comes down to less than $1 million, less than 10%. Skipping the required administrative procedures near the bottom there, the Clean Power Plan, the first iteration of that in 2014, they were going to replace all of that coal-fired electricity with energy efficiency. They had so many comments that you could never, ever do that. You would lose reliability, including from the National Reliability Labs, that they changed it, and they were going to meet it with renewable energy, wind and solar. A change that big requires going back through the Administrative Procedure Act. But if they had done that, they wouldn't have got the thing done before Obama left office, so they simply skipped that step. So what's happening now is the EPA is laying a foundation for progress. They're reviewing the options for ozone quality. And the actual thing they're doing is they're looking at like this lead non-attainment area. They're coming up with, they want to look first who's really out of attainment, and then come up with a specific plan for each area that's in non-attainment of how you fix that. And one of the things you have to do is go back and look at the individual air quality stations. I can tell you about one station that ozone always peaks in the afternoon. That happens to be when bay and ocean breezes come in. There's always more ozone over the water because there's nothing for it to interact with. So it comes in exactly at the time, and that station is just at the wrong place at the wrong time. It also happens to go, it brings the air over a swamp, which is releasing methane, which is a precursor for ozone. So when you do all that, you've got a crappy station. You ought to be doing something about the station. So they're going to be looking at those kinds of issues and coming up with specific plans. Looking at drinking water programs, cutting red tape for Superfund remediation. Butte, Montana, there's a station they've been looking at for 30 years. Administrator Pruitt went out there last week, and he's promising to come up with a plan of what we're actually. There's $40 million of money sitting there that companies paid for creating that site. The money's sitting there. We know we need to do something, so he's going to start taking action on that and cut through the red tape. Reinstating with actions with concerns about employment when you come up with a regulation and reviewing better ways to interact. So one of the things before the time is up here, I'm going to skip the rest of the slides, is what do we do about this? Now, I agree with the endangerment finding. It's probably going to take at least 2 more years to deal with that, if not more. Most of the things we're looking at improving, we're probably going to finish in the next year. But there's something I think is more basic, and some folks I've talked to don't agree with me, but I'm going to push it anyway. The people in this room ought to be getting ready to change the Clean Air Act. When you really get down to it, we need a public debate, and the only place you can do that is in Congress, of what you do about things like carbon dioxide. I mean, the Clean Air Amendment could simply be 3 words, excluding carbon dioxide. Or it could be more complex of saying we're going to set an example, or set a level for ozone, and maybe PM 2.5. And it's going to be set by the legislature rather than keep coming back and keep it coming back. Or it might be a whole redesign of the EPA based on the fact that the states are taking over, and there's going to be less work for the EPA. So my feeling is the reason we're successful right now is we spent several decades preparing for the moment that we had a door open, and the door opened when President Trump was elected. And we were ready to walk in. We knew what needed to be done. We had the data, and we got it in place, and it's being done. And the really optimistic thing is, it is amazing. It's like Christmas with all the things that have happened in the last year and are going to happen in the next year. So we prepared for that. Now, changing the Clean Air Act is going to be a difficult job. But let's be optimistic about 2018 election returns. We may be presented with another opportunity where we can get the Clean Air Act done. But we have to prepare and educate our lawmakers starting now on what needs to be done to change that Clean Air Act. So thank you very much, and we'll be taking your questions soon.